Hello there, and welcome to the Nightcap Historian. Tonight, we are stepping through a doorway that has been closed for nearly 2,000 years. On the other side is a city unlike anything the ancient world had ever produced. A city of marble temples and crumbling tenements, of senators draped in white linen and slaves hauling water up 7 flights of stairs before dawn, of fish sauce that cost more than gold and bread distributed free to 1 million hungry mouths every morning. This city sat on 7 hills above a brown river, and at its height, it held perhaps 1 million people within its walls pressed together, layered on top of one another, speaking dozens of languages, worshipping hundreds of gods, living and dying in a space so dense and so loud and so alive that even its own citizens sometimes struggled to believe it was real. Rome. Not the Rome of marble statues and silent museums, not the Rome of textbooks and battle maps and emperors frozen in stone. The living Rome, the Rome that smelled of bread and sewage and pine resin and salt fish. The Rome where someone was always arguing, always building, always praying, always selling something from a cart at the corner of a street too narrow for 2 carts to pass each other. Tonight we are going to walk those streets together. We are going to move through a single Roman day from before dawn until long after dark. We are going to pass through the rooms of a senator's house and the cellar of a rented apartment. We are going to stand at the edge of the arena and sit in the steam of the baths and eat at a counter in a busy tavern and watch the sun set behind the Capitoline Hill. And through all of it, we are going to ask the question that history so rarely answers completely. What was it actually like? Wherever you are right now, let this be your moment to set the day down completely. Let your jaw unclench, let your shoulders drop away from your ears, feel your hands grow heavy and still. Notice your breathing, and let it slow, just slightly, until it finds its own quiet rhythm. You do not need to remember any of this. You do not need to take notes or hold on to details. Simply let the words move through you like lantern light through a narrow Roman street, flickering, warm, and gone before you can quite catch it. The city is waiting. The torches are lit. The bread is already baking somewhere in the dark. Let's begin. If you find that these slow journeys through history bring you a sense of calm or carry you gently towards sleep, I would be honored if you would like and subscribe. It helps other tired souls find their way here, one quiet night at a time. But for now, Rome is waking up, and so are we. Rome never truly went to sleep. Even in the deepest hours of the night, the city breathed. By law, wheeled vehicles were banned from the streets of Rome during daylight hours. The city was simply too crowded, too chaotic, too loud for carts and wagons to move through its veins, while 1 million people were also trying to move through them. And so the night belonged to the wheels. From dusk until dawn, the city rumbled. Wooden cart wheels ground over stone paving. Oxen lowed and strained. Delivery men cursed and shouted. Grain arrived from the river docks. Building stone arrived from the quarries. Wine amphorae arrived from the countryside by the hundreds. The Roman writer Juvenal complained that it was impossible to sleep in the city because of the noise. He described lying awake listening to the grinding of axles, the bellowing of animals, the clatter and crash of commerce that never stopped. For most Romans, the night was not silence. It was the city restocking itself, like a living body breathing in while its mind rested. Rome woke before sunrise, and it woke all at once. There were no alarm clocks in ancient Rome. There was no single moment of waking. Instead, the city gradually brightened from its own internal rhythms, bakers firing their ovens, cocks crowing across the hills, the last carts rattling away as the ban on wheeled traffic came back into effect. The wealthy woke to the sound of their own slaves, moving quietly through corridors, preparing the household for the day. A cup of water, the opening of shutters, the soft sound of sandals on mosaic floors. The poor woke to whatever was happening outside their windows, and in Rome's crowded apartment blocks, something was always happening outside the window. A neighbor arguing, a baby crying, the smell of smoke from someone's brazier on the floor below. Rome did not ease into consciousness. It simply opened its eyes and got up, all at once, and started moving. The Roman day was divided not by clocks but by light, and time itself moved differently depending on the season. Romans divided the day into 12 hours of daylight and 12 hours of darkness, regardless of the actual length of the day. This meant that a summer hour was significantly longer than a winter hour. Time itself stretched and contracted with the seasons. Sundials could be found throughout the city, mounted on public buildings and in the forums, but they were imprecise guides at best. Most Romans gauged the time by the quality of the light, by the position of the sun, by what other people around them were doing. The first hour of the day began at sunrise. The 6th hour Horus Sexta was midday, when the sun was highest and the city was most fully alive. The 9th hour Nona marked the beginning of the afternoon's long, slow decline. And the 12th hour, the final hour of daylight, shaded into the evening that Romans called the Vesper. Time in Rome was approximate. It was social. You knew what hour it was by looking around you. Breakfast in Rome was not a meal. It was barely an interruption. The Romans did not regard morning as a time for eating. Most people ate almost nothing before the late morning or midday. A piece of bread dipped in olive oil, perhaps. A handful of olives. A cup of watered wine pasca, which was less a luxury than a basic safe alternative to water of uncertain quality. The wealthy might eat a slightly more elaborate version of this simple spread, with cheese or a few figs, served on fine pottery in a comfortable room while a slave read the morning's correspondence aloud. The very poor might eat nothing at all until they could collect their daily grain allowance, the annona, or until they found work that entitled them to a meal. The Roman relationship with food was concentrated almost entirely at the end of the day. The cena, the main meal, was the center of Roman social life. Everything before it was preliminary. Morning eating was practical, minimal, and almost entirely without ceremony. Rome's apartment buildings were among the tallest structures in the ancient world and among the most dangerous places to live. The Insulae Islands were Rome's great vertical experiment. These apartment blocks rose 5, 6, sometimes 7 stories above the street, their upper floors leaning out over the narrow lanes below, blocking light and trapping heat. Ground floor apartments were the most desirable and the most expensive. They had direct access to the street, more solid walls, and the lowest risk from the building's 2 great enemies, fire and collapse. Upper floors were cheaper, colder in winter, hotter in summer, and terrifying in the event of an emergency. There were no fire escapes. There was no running water above the ground floor. Anyone who lived on the 5th or 6th story carried every drop of water they used up a staircase that was rarely more than a steep, narrow shaft cut through the center of the building. And fires were constant. Rome burned. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in small, persistent fires that broke out in kitchens and workshops and spread through buildings made of timber and plaster and packed too closely together to allow a fire break. The Emperor Augustus created the vigils, Rome's combined fire brigade and night watch, precisely because the city kept burning itself down. But the vigiles could only do so much against a city that was essentially dry tinder stacked 7 stories high. The streets of Rome were narrow, chaotic, and astonishingly loud even by the standards of any modern city. Rome's famous streets, the ones we see reconstructed in museums and films, wide and straight and paved with beautiful stone, were not the reality for most Romans. The main thoroughfares, like the Via Sacra, were indeed impressive. But the streets that most Romans walked every day were something else entirely. They were narrow. In some neighborhoods, 2 people with laden baskets could barely pass each other. The upper floors of apartment buildings on opposite sides of a street were close enough that neighbors could and did hand things to each other across the gap. They were noisy. Cobblers hammered. Metalworkers clanged. Street vendors called out their prices in voices trained to carry above the general din. School children recited their lessons aloud in porticos and doorways because their teachers had no indoor space. They were dirty, Romans had public latrines, remarkable engineering achievements, but the streets themselves received whatever fell, flowed, or was thrown from the floors above. Stepping stones were placed at intersections precisely so that pedestrians could cross without walking through the accumulated filth. And yet Romans moved through these streets with ease and familiarity, the way any people move through the places they have always known. The chaos was their ordinary. The noise was their silence. Rome had no addresses, and yet everyone knew where everything was. There was no formal street naming system in ancient Rome. There were no numbered buildings. If you wanted to tell someone where you lived, you described it. Near the Temple of Saturn, past the fuller's workshop on the corner, the building with the green shutters, third door from the stairs. This system worked because Romans were deeply local. Most people lived their entire lives within a few neighborhoods. They knew every shop, every fountain, every landmark within their daily radius. The city was memorized, not mapped. Neighborhoods were called vici, and each had its own identity, its own patron gods enshrined in small street corner shrines called compitalia, its own networks of social obligation and neighborly knowledge. People identified themselves by their neighborhood before they identified themselves by any other category. To be lost in Rome was unusual. Everyone knew where you were, even if you didn't. The morning salutatio was one of the most important rituals in Roman social life, a daily performance of power and obligation. For wealthy Romans, senators, equestrians, men of standing, the first social act of every morning was receiving visitors. This ceremony was called the salutatio, and it was not optional for anyone involved. The powerful man sat in the atrium of his house, the great open central room, while a stream of clients came to pay their respects. These were men of lower status who depended on his patronage for jobs, legal support, social connections, and occasionally actual food in the form of the sportula, a small gift of food or money given to clients who showed up reliably. For the clients, the morning visit was an act of visible loyalty. You showed up, you waited, sometimes for hours, in an anteroom with other waiting men. You were eventually admitted, you greeted your patron, you asked for whatever you needed, and you left. For the patron, it was a demonstration of importance. The more clients waiting in your atrium, the more powerful you appeared. A great man's morning was measured partly by how long the line of visitors stretched down his entrance hall. The entire system was a kind of daily theater, in which everyone played their role and the audience was everyone else in the neighborhood watching through the open door. Slavery was the foundation on which Roman civilization rested, and it touched every aspect of daily life. At the height of the empire, perhaps 1 in 4 people in Rome was enslaved. In wealthy households, the number of enslaved people could reach into the hundreds. In the households of emperors, the imperial slave staff numbered in the thousands. Enslaved people did almost everything. They cooked, they cleaned, they educated children, they managed accounts and correspondence, they performed surgery, they wrote poetry, they ran businesses on behalf of their owners, sometimes accumulating their own wealth in the process. The condition of an enslaved person varied enormously depending on who owned them and what they were required to do. Some lived in relative comfort, treated with a degree of professional respect. Others were worked to death in the mines of Spain or the agricultural estates of Sicily under conditions of almost unimaginable brutality. What did not vary was the legal reality. An enslaved person was property. They could be sold, inherited, punished, or freed at the whim of their owner. They had no legal standing, no protection under most of Rome's elaborate civil law, no claim to their own children. And yet Roman society was so thoroughly dependent on enslaved labor that it could not have functioned for a single day without it. Every aqueduct, every road, every monument, every comfortable morning in a senator's house was built on the labor of people who had no choice but to provide it. The Roman Forum was the center of the known world, and it was never quiet. Imagine walking into the Forum Romanum on a morning in the 1st century. You enter through a narrow space between the Temple of Saturn and the Basilica Julia, and suddenly the city opens before you, a vast irregular space surrounded on all sides by temples, government buildings, and colonnaded halls. The ground beneath your feet is worn smooth by the passage of millions. The air smells of sacrificial smoke and the particular smell of crowds' sweat and wool and perfumed oil and roasting meat from a vendor at the edge of the space. Here, the law courts were in session. Lawyers argued before magistrates in the basilicas that lined the forum. Crowds gathered to watch. Romans loved the theater of legal argument, and a skilled orator could draw an audience the way a performer draws one. Here, political speeches were delivered from the rostra, a raised platform decorated with the bronze rams of captured enemy ships. Here, elections were announced, decrees were posted on whitened boards, and the daily machinery of Roman governance ground forward in full public view. The forum was not a monument, it was a machine, and it ran every single day. Rome had an elaborate system of public fountains, and for most Romans, this was the only source of clean water they would ever touch. Water was one of Rome's great achievements. The aqueducts, those remarkable stone bridges that still stand in fragments across Europe, carried millions of gallons of fresh water into the city every day from distant springs and rivers. But this water did not reach most Romans in their homes. It flowed first to the great public fountains, the lacus that were placed throughout every neighborhood. From there, it was the responsibility of each household to collect what they needed. For those in the upper floors of apartment buildings, this meant daily trips down the stairs with heavy clay pots, to the fountain on the corner, and then back up again, multiple times a day, in every weather. Water carriers, aquarii, could be hired to perform this labor, but they were an expense that not everyone could afford. For the very poor, water was one of the day's first physical demands. Before you could cook, before you could wash, before you could begin almost any domestic task, you had to carry water uphill. The fountains themselves were social spaces. People waited, talked, argued, exchanged news. In a city with no newspapers and no phones, the public fountain was one of the places where information moved. Roman public latrines were communal, social, and entirely without privacy, and Romans thought this was completely normal. The foracae public latrines were among the most remarkable public spaces Rome provided. These were large rooms, sometimes elegantly decorated, featuring stone or marble seats arranged in a continuous row along the walls, with gaps cut for use and a channel of running water beneath. There were no stalls, there were no partitions. You sat side by side with strangers and continued whatever conversation you were having, or started a new one. The Romans saw nothing unusual about this. Bodily functions were not shameful, they were simply functions. Foracae were social spaces, business was conducted there, friends met there. The daily rhythms of conversation and connection continued without interruption. Beneath the seats, a constant flow of water carried waste away through Rome's remarkable sewer system. The Cloaca Maxima, one of the great engineering achievements of the ancient world, parts of which still function today. A sponge on a stick, the xylospongium, was the shared cleaning implement, rinsed in a channel of running water between uses. Romans considered this hygienic. To modernize, it requires a different understanding of what cleanliness meant in a world without the assumptions we carry about solitude and sanitation. The Roman baths, the thermae, were not a luxury. They were a daily necessity and the social heart of the city. Every Roman city of any size had public baths. Rome itself had hundreds of neighborhood baths and several enormous imperial complexes, the thermae of Caracalla, of Diocletian, of Agrippa, that could accommodate thousands of bathers simultaneously. Admission was cheap, sometimes it was free, and the baths were open to everyone, men and women, citizens and foreigners, the wealthy and the working poor. The bathing circuit moved through a sequence of rooms. You began in the apoditerium, the changing room, where you left your clothes with an attendant and kept one eye on them, because theft at the baths was as Roman as bathing itself. Then you moved through the tepidarium, the warm room, where the body began to adjust. Then the caldarium, the hot room, filled with steam and the smell of bodies and the particular mineral smell of volcanic heating systems. Finally, for the brave, the frigidarium, the cold plunge which Romans considered both invigorating and medicinal. But the baths were not primarily about washing. They were about being Roman together. You exercised in the palestra beforehand, wrestling, ball games, weightlifting of a sort. You had your body scraped with the strigil, a curved metal tool that removed oil, sweat, and dead skin in the absence of soap. You ate, you talked, you conducted business, you argued philosophy. The baths were where Roman social life actually happened, across every class and condition, every afternoon of every day. A Roman soldier's daily life was governed by routine, hierarchy, and the particular discipline that held an empire together. At its peak, the Roman legions numbered perhaps 150,000 men, professional soldiers serving 25-year terms of service. Add the auxiliary forces, troops drawn from the provinces, and the total military strength of Rome approached 400,000 men, stationed across an empire that stretched from Scotland to Mesopotamia. A legionary's day began before dawn. He rose in his barracks, the contubernium, a shared room for 8 men, and began the tasks that defined military life. Equipment was inspected. Weapons were maintained. The camp was kept in a state of order that Romans regarded not as excessive but as the minimum standard for survival. Training was constant and systematic. Even in times of peace, legionaries marched typically 20 Roman miles a day in full armor to maintain the physical conditioning that made Roman infantry so formidable. They practiced formations, weapons drills, and the construction of fortifications. Every night in the field, a Roman army built a camp ditch, rampart, palisade, even if it was only going to be used for a single night. The pay was decent by Roman standards, but it was partially withheld in deductions for food, equipment, and the burial club that would ensure a proper funeral. A soldier's real wealth accumulated slowly, in the savings he managed to accumulate over decades of service. What he also accumulated, less tangibly, was identity. A Roman soldier belonged to his legion the way someone belongs to a family, with pride, obligation, and a depth of loyalty that shaped every decision he made. The Roman diet was more sophisticated and more varied than most people imagine, but it was also more heavily reliant on a few simple staples than any modern diet. Grain was the foundation of everything. Bread, porridge, flatbreads, grain, in one form or another, made up the majority of calories for most Romans across all classes. The state distributed grain to citizens of Rome. Eventually, over 200,000 people received this dole, precisely because a city that could not feed itself was a city that would tear itself apart. Olive oil was the second great staple. It was used for cooking, for lighting, for skincare, for religious purposes. Rome consumed extraordinary quantities of it, importing from the olive groves of Spain and North Africa in such volume that the Monte Testaccio, a hill near the Tiber docks, is composed almost entirely of the broken fragments of the oil amphorae that were discarded there over centuries. Garum fermented fish sauce was the flavor that Romans put on almost everything. It sounds off-putting by modern standards, but it was essentially the umami of the ancient world. There were luxury grades and everyday grades. It traveled across the empire in sealed amphorae. A truly fine garum, from the right region, commanded a price that would shock a modern fish market. Wine was drunk by almost everyone, almost always diluted with water. Drinking undiluted wine was considered a sign of barbarism. A Roman at the table mixed his wine carefully, sometimes warming it in winter, sometimes chilling it with snow brought down from the mountains in summer. The vegetables and legumes, lentils, chickpeas, broad beans, cabbage, onions, leeks were the workhorses of the everyday diet. Meat was expensive and occasional for most people, though pork was the most accessible and most beloved. Street food was the dominant cuisine of Rome because most Romans had no kitchen at all. The great majority of Romans who lived in apartment buildings had no facility for cooking beyond a small brazier, an open charcoal burner, on which limited heating and simple preparation was possible. Full cooking was a fire risk in buildings that were already terrifyingly flammable, and it was prohibited in many insulae. And so Rome fed itself on the street. The Thermopolium, the ancient Roman fast food counter, was one of the most common commercial establishments in the city. These were small storefronts, with counters set into the street-facing wall, each counter embedded with large ceramic jars called dolia that held prepared foods, kept warm by hot water or heated stones below. Excavations at Pompeii, frozen in time by Vesuvius in 79 CE, have revealed Thermopolium counters still intact, their dolia still readable, their menus still partially interpretable: duck, goat, fish with wine sauce, chickpea soup, salted olives. You stopped at the counter, pointed at what you wanted, paid, and moved on. Or you sat on the low bench along the wall, ate with your fingers, and listened to whatever argument was happening at the next counter. Romans ate the way people in any busy city eat when time is short and kitchens are unavailable: quickly, standing, in the middle of everything, without ceremony. The Roman marketplace, the Macellum, was a sensory experience that overwhelmed the senses of everyone who entered it. Rome's food markets were not gentle places. They were loud, crowded, intensely aromatic, and brilliantly alive. The Macellum was typically a covered market hall, a courtyard surrounded by small shops, with a central island where the most desirable goods were displayed. Fish was prominent, often very fresh, and loudly guaranteed to be so by vendors who were not above creative descriptions of their catch. The fishmongers occupied a particular place in Roman satirical literature. They were celebrated for their arrogance, their prices, and their absolute refusal to negotiate when they knew their fish was good. Wealthy Romans who arrived at the fish stalls of the Macellum and objected to the price were told, politely or otherwise, to move along and come back when they were serious buyers. Butchers sold pork from shops that doubled as slaughterhouses. The sound and smell of this commerce was inseparable from the product. Spice sellers offered goods that had traveled from India and Arabia and the distant corners of Africa. Honey vendors, cheese merchants, sellers of dried fruits and nuts and the preserved goods that kept through winter. And through all of it moved the particular noise of Roman commerce: bargaining, arguing, complimenting, insulting, laughing, conducted in Latin and Greek and Aramaic and Punic and a dozen other languages that all merged into the great sound of a city feeding itself. Children in Rome were educated in ways that would seem strikingly familiar and strikingly harsh in equal measure. Roman children began formal education around age 7. For the wealthy, this often meant private tutors, frequently enslaved Greeks, whose culture Rome both conquered and deeply admired. For others, it meant attending a school run by a grammaticus, a teacher who held class wherever space could be found in a rented room, a covered portico, sometimes simply at the edge of a public space. The curriculum was focused and demanding, reading and writing in both Latin and Greek, arithmetic, using the abacus and the Roman numeral system, grammar, rhetoric, and the memorization of classical literature. A Roman child of any ambition was expected to be able to recite significant passages of Virgil and Homer from memory. Public speaking was not an elective. It was the core skill of Roman civic life. Discipline was physical and unquestioned. The teacher's rod, the ferula, was the most familiar object in many Roman schoolrooms, and its use was considered not cruelty, but correct instruction. Romans did not sentimentalize childhood in the way many later cultures did. Children were small future adults, and the training that made them into proper adults was supposed to be rigorous. And yet Roman literature is full of the warmth that parents felt for their children. The grief of infant mortality, which was tragically common, sits in Roman writing like an undercurrent of sorrow beneath the philosophy and the politics. Women in Rome occupied a legal position that was complicated, restricted, and in practice sometimes surprisingly powerful. Under Roman law, women of the early republic were subject to the authority of a male guardian, their father, then their husband, then the nearest male relative throughout their lives. A Roman woman could not vote, hold public office, or conduct legal business without a guardian's involvement. And yet, wealthy Roman women managed households that were effectively small enterprises. They controlled their own property in ways that evolved significantly over the centuries of the empire. They educated themselves. They corresponded with public figures. They influenced politics through the men they were connected to, mothers, wives, sisters whose voices carried weight precisely because they operated in a social world where direct access was everything. The women of the imperial family, the empress, the emperor's mother, his sisters, could wield extraordinary informal power. Livia, the wife of Augustus, was so influential that later writers debated whether she actually governed Rome. Agrippina the Younger, mother of Nero, was openly acknowledged to be making decisions that affected the empire. And ordinary Roman women, merchants' wives, freedwomen who ran their own businesses, women of the working neighborhoods navigated their world with a practical agency that the legal framework doesn't fully capture. The law said one thing. The streets of Rome said something more complicated and more human. The Colosseum was not built for gladiators. It was built for politics, and it happened to use gladiators as its instrument. The Flavian amphitheater, which later generations called the Colosseum, was begun under Emperor Vespasian around 70 CE and completed under Titus in 80 CE. It seated perhaps 50,000 to 80,000 people across its 4 tiers, with seating arranged according to social rank. The emperor and the Vestal virgins sat at the level of the arena itself, in the best seats in the house. Senators occupied the first tier, equestrians the second, ordinary male citizens the third. Women and the poor were packed into the steep wooden upper tier, farthest from the action and least able to see it clearly. This arrangement was not accidental. It was a map of Roman society in seating form. Every time Romans looked down at the arena, they also looked around them and saw exactly where they ranked in the order of things. The games the Munera were public entertainment paid for by wealthy patrons and emperors. They were also political theater. An emperor who provided spectacular games was popular. An emperor who was stingy with the games was not. The crowd's response to the emperor in the arena was one of the few spaces where ordinary Romans could express public opinion without consequence. They cheered, they booed, they demanded the death or the mercy of a fallen gladiator, and the emperor, sitting in his box with the eyes of 50,000 people on him, had to decide which way to turn his thumb and do it in a way that the crowd would approve. The arena was not only a place where men died, it was a place where power negotiated with the people it ruled. We have walked through the morning now, from the first rumble of delivery carts, through the long business of the forum and the market and the arena. And what strikes you, perhaps, is how much of Roman life was conducted in public. Romans did not retreat behind closed doors to live. They spilled out into the streets, the forums, the baths, the markets, the spectacles. The city itself was the home, loud, chaotic, endlessly social, impossible to escape. There was something both exhausting and sustaining about this way of living. To be Roman was to be perpetually in the presence of other Romans. The solitude that many of us now consider necessary for health and sanity was not a Roman value. Togetherness, even uncomfortable, noisy, contentious togetherness was. Let that thought settle quietly, and let's continue walking through their world. Gladiators were not the condemned criminals of popular imagination. Most were professional athletes with contracts, trainers, and career trajectories. The gladiatorial system was more organized and less randomly brutal than its Hollywood image suggests. Most gladiators were volunteers, men who had sold themselves to a gladiatorial school, or lanista, in exchange for training, housing, food, and medical care. The schools were serious institutions. They had training grounds, equipment rooms, surgeries staffed by physicians, and a hierarchical system of ranks and specializations. The food provided to gladiators was notoriously good, high in carbohydrates for energy, with careful attention to maintaining the layer of subcutaneous fat that helped protect against slash wounds. There were different types of gladiators, each with specific equipment and fighting styles. The retiarius fought with a net and trident, light and mobile. The secutor was heavily armored, pursuing the retiarius with sword and shield. The murmillo wore a fish-crested helmet and carried a large shield. These matchups were carefully designed to create visually interesting, dramatically variable combat. A successful gladiator could fight perhaps 2 or 3 times a year. He could earn prize money. He could become famous, the ancient equivalent of a celebrity athlete, with his name scratched on the walls of the city in graffiti, with admirers who collected souvenirs. Death, when it came, was not the point. It was the risk ever present, impossible to ignore, that gave the combat its charge. But both fighters were valuable property, and a dead gladiator was a financial loss to the lanista who had trained him. The fate of a defeated gladiator was decided by the crowd, but the crowd's power was more symbolic than absolute. When a gladiator fell and could fight no more, he raised his left hand, the index finger extended to signal submission. This was the missio, the request for mercy. The crowd then expressed its opinion. Waving handkerchiefs and raising thumbs indicated mercy. Extending closed fists or turning thumbs in various directions indicated death. The precise meaning of the thumb gesture has been debated by historians for centuries, and the Hollywood version, thumb up for life, thumb down for death, is almost certainly a later invention. What is certain is that the editor, the official presiding over the games, made the final decision. He would consider the crowd's mood, the quality of the fight, the standing of the fallen gladiator, and his own political interests. Mercy shown too easily seemed weak. Death ordered too casually seemed cruel. A gladiator who had fought well and bravely was usually spared. A gladiator who had fought poorly, or who had tried to avoid combat, was more likely to face the blade. The crowd wanted skill and courage rewarded. They were not, by and large, simply thirsty for death. They wanted theater. They wanted a story with a clear moral. And the gladiators, who understood their audience, as well as any performer, did their best to give it to them. Beyond gladiatorial combat, the arena also hosted animal hunts, the venationes that consumed thousands of animals from across the known world. The morning session of a Roman spectacle day was typically given over to animal hunts. The venationes, in which professional hunters called bestiari fought or displayed exotic animals from every corner of the empire. Beyond, lions from North Africa, tigers from Persia, elephants from the Saharan south, ostriches, bears, leopards, rhinoceroses, hippopotamuses. Rome's appetite for animal spectacle drove what would today be recognized as the systematic commercial hunting of wildlife across multiple continents. For the Roman audience, many of these animals were things they had heard of, but never seen creatures from the edges of the world that the empire had reached and dominated. Seeing a lion die in the arena was, in a very Roman way, a demonstration of the empire's reach. We have gone everywhere. We have brought everything back. Even the wilderness itself submits to Rome. The environmental cost was catastrophic. The lion populations of North Africa, the elephant populations of the Mediterranean world, and countless other species were devastated by the demand of the Roman entertainment industry over several centuries. What Rome called spectacle, the natural world paid for in a currency it could not easily replenish. Roman law was one of the great intellectual achievements of the ancient world, a system so sophisticated that it forms the foundation of most modern European legal traditions. By the height of the empire, Rome had accumulated centuries of legal development statutes, edicts, precedents, and above all, the elaborate commentaries of the great jurists who interpreted and refined the law throughout the classical period. Roman law distinguished between public law, the law governing the relationship between citizens and the state, and private law, which governed relationships between individuals. The law of property, contract, inheritance, and personal status was developed with a sophistication that astonished later legal scholars. For an ordinary Roman, the law was both a protection and a labyrinth. The courts, the iudicia, were accessible in principle, but navigating them required either wealth, education, or the assistance of a patron. Legal representation by trained advocates who were not supposed to charge fees, though they certainly received gifts, was a significant advantage. The most human glimpse of Roman law comes not from the great commentaries, but from the actual papyrus documents that survive contracts for the sale of slaves, wills that carefully specify who gets the silver plate, letters complaining about a neighbor who has encroached on a property boundary. The law was not abstract philosophy to the people who lived under it. It was the framework within which they fought, inherited, married, divorced, bought, sold, and died. Roman marriage was a civil contract rather than a religious ceremony, and divorce was straightforward and common. Roman marriage matrimonium did not require a priest, a religious ceremony, or even a formal document, though documents were common and practical. What constituted a Roman marriage was primarily the mutual intention of two people to be married, combined with the consent of their fathers. The ceremony that typically accompanied this legal reality was celebratory rather than sacred: a procession, a dinner, the joining of hands, the signing of a marriage contract in front of witnesses, and the traditional phrase spoken by the bride, ubi tu Gaius, ego Gaia, where you are Gaius, I am Gaia. Divorce was equally uncomplicated. Either partner could initiate it by simply declaring the intention and, if relevant, returning the dowry. There was social stigma attached to excessive divorcing. Julius Caesar was considered something of an outlier by even Roman standards, but the legal mechanism was frictionless. This meant that marriage in Rome functioned more honestly as what it often functionally is in any society: a social and economic arrangement between families, regulated by law, and dissoluble when it no longer served its purposes. Romantic love was celebrated in Roman poetry with genuine passion, but it was not considered the primary foundation of a stable marriage. Stability, children, social alliance, property management, these were the things that made a Roman marriage work. Love, when it arrived, was a welcome supplement. Funerals in Rome were elaborate public events, especially for the powerful, and death was treated as a community concern rather than a private grief. Roman funerary practice was shaped by two competing needs: the desire to honor the dead and the very practical concern of managing decomposition in a Mediterranean climate. Bodies were typically buried or cremated within a day, which made the period of preparation and mourning brief and intense. For a wealthy Roman, the funis began immediately. The body was washed, anointed with oils and perfumes, and displayed in the atrium of the house for a brief period of mourning. A coin was placed on the tongue, the payment to Charon, the ferryman who carried souls across the Styx. Then came the procession, and for the truly wealthy, this was theater of the highest Roman order. Professional mourners hired women who wept and wailed with practiced expertise, led the procession. Musicians followed. Then came actors wearing the imagined wax masks of the dead man's distinguished ancestors, walking in costume, performing the identities of the great men who had come before. The dead were buried outside the city walls. Roman law forbade burial within the city along the roads that led out of Rome. The tombs that lined these roads were not hidden away. They were visible, public, and often elaborately inscribed, because Romans considered it important that the living remember the dead and that the dead be seen to have mattered. The Roman concept of the afterlife was flexible, uncertain, and surprisingly varied across different people and traditions. Unlike some ancient religious systems, Rome had no single definitive theology of what happened after death. The traditional vision, the underworld of Hades, filtered through Greek mythology and Roman adaptation, involved the soul traveling to a shadowy realm divided between the peaceful Elysian fields for the virtuous, the grim asphodel meadows for the ordinary dead, and Tartarus for the wicked. But educated Romans were often skeptical of this literal geography. Philosophers, particularly those of the Stoic and Epicurean traditions, had very different accounts. The Epicureans, following their founder, believed that the soul dissolved at death along with the body, that there was no afterlife, and that death therefore held nothing to fear. Lucretius wrote this position with a serene beauty that still resonates today. The mystery religions, the cults of Isis, of Mithras, of Dionysus offered initiates the promise of a blessed immortality earned through ritual and initiation, appealing especially to people who found the traditional Roman religious system too distant and impersonal. And then there was the Roman tradition of the lares and the penates, the household gods, the ancestors whose spirits lingered in the home, who received daily offerings of wine and bread, and were considered genuinely present in the lives of the living. Death in Rome was not settled. It was debated, feared, approached with ceremony, and ultimately faced the way Romans faced most things, with a mixture of philosophical composure and human anxiety. Rome had no police force, and private violence was a constant feature of urban life, particularly after dark. The vigils, the night watch, were primarily firefighters. Their secondary function as a kind of police force was limited in scope and effectiveness. There was no detective corps, no criminal investigation, no systematic patrol of the city's neighborhoods. This meant that personal security in Rome was largely a private matter. Walking alone after dark in certain neighborhoods was understood to be dangerous. Juvenal complained with his characteristic exaggeration, but some basis in reality that a Roman out at night could expect to be jostled, robbed, or assaulted, or possibly have a chamber pot emptied on his head from an upper window. Wealthy Romans moved through the city attended by slaves and freedmen who served as escorts and protection. A senator's litter, the lectica, carried by trained bearers, was both transport and a mobile display of status that tended to discourage casual interference. For those without such resources, the Roman night was navigated with awareness, speed, and the hope that nothing particularly unpleasant would happen before you reached your door. Most of the time it didn't, but the absence of any systematic public safety meant that when something did happen, your options were limited. Rome was a city that largely policed itself through social pressure, through the patron-client relationships that made violence against known people a social problem, and through the simple mathematics of a very dense population where witnesses were rarely hard to find. The Roman economy was sophisticated, globally connected, and deeply dependent on the movement of goods across the Mediterranean, which Romans called our sea. Mare nostrum, our sea. The Romans called the Mediterranean this without irony. By the height of the empire, Roman trade networks extended from the tin mines of Cornwall to the silk roads of China, from the amber coasts of the Baltic to the spice markets of India. Ships from Alexandria brought grain. Ships from Spain brought olive oil and silver. Ships from Gaul brought wine and fine ceramics. Ships from the east brought silk, pepper, cinnamon, and the aromatic resins that burned in every Roman temple. The Roman merchant, the negotiator, or mercator, occupied a socially complicated position. Trade was the foundation of Roman prosperity, but the senatorial class was theoretically prohibited from engaging in commerce directly. It was considered beneath the dignity of a man, whose identity was tied to land and public service. In practice, wealthy Romans participated in trade through freedmen agents, and through complex financial arrangements that maintained a degree of plausible distance. The financial instruments of Roman commerce were sophisticated by ancient standards: letters of credit, partnerships, loans at interest, maritime insurance of a sort. The Roman banking system, centered on the money changers and lenders who operated from the porticos around the Forum, provided the financial infrastructure for an economy of considerable complexity. What made all of this possible was the political stability, imperfect, periodically disrupted, but real, that the empire imposed on a space that had previously been fragmented by war. Safe seas, maintained roads, standardized weights and measures, and a common legal framework created the conditions for trade to flourish at a scale that the ancient world had never previously seen. Roman religion was not about belief, it was about practice, and the correct performance of ritual was the foundation of Rome's relationship with its gods. Romans did not require that you believe in the gods in the way that later monotheistic traditions required belief. What they required was that you honor the gods correctly, that you perform the sacrifices, observe the festivals, maintain the temples, and participate in the public ceremonies that kept the divine relationship in good order. This was called pietas, often translated as piety, but really meaning something more like correct fulfillment of obligations. A pious Roman was not necessarily a deeply spiritual person. A pious Roman was one who performed the required rituals faithfully and did not disrupt the proper relationship between the city and the divine powers on which its prosperity depended. The Roman religious calendar was crowded with festivals. Virtually every month had multiple days of celebration dedicated to various deities. The Lupercalia in February, the Floralia in April and May, the Saturnalia in December. These were not solemn occasions. Many Roman festivals involved feasting, drinking, games, theatrical performances, and a general loosening of the usual social order. The Saturnalia, which fell near the winter solstice, was perhaps the most remarkable, a period during which masters waited on their slaves, social hierarchies were temporarily inverted, and gifts were exchanged. The parallel to later winter celebrations is obvious and has been argued about by scholars ever since. We are deep in the Roman day now, past midday, into the long warm afternoon that Romans surrendered so readily to the pleasures of the baths and the social obligations of friendship. What strikes you, perhaps, is how thoroughly Rome had organized the business of being alive. There was a structure for almost everything: the hours of the day, the hierarchy of the seating in the arena, the sequence of rooms in the bathhouse, the order of the funeral procession, the correct words to say at the altar. And yet within all that structure, the Romans remained spectacularly, defiantly human. They gossiped, they cheated, they loved their children and their pets and their gardens. They worried about money. They complained about their neighbors. The architecture of Roman life was grand. The people who lived inside it were exactly the kind of complicated, contradictory, fully alive creatures that people have always been. Let's find them in the afternoon, where Roman life grew slower and more personal. The Roman afternoon, the post-meridium, was the time for rest, pleasure, and the extended social rituals that Romans considered essential to a good life. After the morning's business, the salutatio, the forum, the markets, the law courts, Rome shifted tempo in the early afternoon. The intense activity of the first half of the day gave way to something slower and more personal. Wealthy Romans retired for a nap, the meridiatio, in the deep heat of the afternoon, when the sun was at its most insistent, and the sensible response was to lie on a cool couch in a shaded room and let the hours pass. The baths were typically most crowded in the early afternoon, when working people could take their hours of leisure. The social afternoon, the time for visiting friends, for extended conversation, for the elaborate dinner preparations that would consume the early evening, unfolded at a pace that the frenetic morning could not have sustained. There is something to admire in this arrangement. Romans had organized their day to include rest, pleasure, and human connection as non-negotiable elements, rather than luxuries to be earned. The afternoon belonged to life as it was meant to be lived, not to the mechanisms that sustained it. The Roman garden, the hortus, was a place of profound importance to Roman spiritual and aesthetic life. Every Roman house of any pretension had a garden. In the great urban mansions, the domus, the garden, was typically at the rear, beyond the dining rooms, enclosed by colonnades, planted with carefully chosen plants, and often decorated with fountains, sculptures, and painted garden scenes on the surrounding walls. In Pompeii, excavations have revealed these gardens with extraordinary intimacy. The planting patterns are sometimes still readable. The root casts left in volcanic ash have allowed botanists to identify the specific plants: roses, violets, acanthus, box hedges trimmed into geometric shapes, fruit trees carefully trained. Romans regarded the garden as a philosophical space as much as a practical one. The Epicurean tradition philosophy as the cultivation of simple pleasures, friendship, and tranquility was closely associated with the image of the garden as a place of retreat from the noise and obligation of public life. For apartment dwellers with no private garden, the public parks and the tree-lined porticos that surrounded many of Rome's great public buildings served a similar function. Rome was not a green city in any modern sense, but it had pockets of shade and growing things that were considered essential rather than ornamental. Rome's poets captured daily life with a specificity that brings the city alive across 2,000 years of distance. Horace, Ovid, Martial, Juvenal, these were not poets writing for posterity. They were writing for their contemporaries, in the specific language of their specific moment, full of references and jokes and complaints that were immediately legible to anyone walking the streets of Rome in the 1st or 2nd century. Martial's epigrams are particularly extraordinary in this regard. In 1,500 short poems, he captures the textures of Roman daily life with the precision of a documentarian. The noise of the city, the behavior of clients, the pleasures of good food and wine, the frustrations of bad neighbors, the sadness of early death, the comedy of social pretension. He complains about a neighbor who wakes him with music lessons. He celebrates a friend's return from abroad. He describes the smell of a bakery in the morning and the taste of a fig given as a gift. He chronicles the parties of the wealthy and the loneliness of the poor with equal attention. Reading Martial is to realize that the distance between Rome and any modern city is smaller than you might expect. The forms change, the technology changes, the specific complaints are different, but the underlying human experience, the need for food, rest, connection, beauty, meaning, and occasional silence has not changed at all. The emperor occupied a position of theoretically absolute power and was also, in practice, dependent on the goodwill of people he could not fully control. The emperor's power was real and vast. He commanded the armies. He controlled the treasury. He appointed governors, judges, and officials throughout an empire that stretched thousands of miles in every direction. His word, in principle, was law. But the emperor also governed a city of 1 million people who were not afraid to make their opinions known. He managed a senate that, though stripped of its Republican-era power, still contained men of ancient family and considerable influence. He depended on the Praetorian Guard, his personal military escort, headquartered just outside the city walls, whose loyalty was purchased and occasionally withdrawn at precisely the moments it was most needed. The history of the Roman emperors is, in part, a catalogue of the various ways in which nominally absolute power can be constrained by reality. Augustus ruled for 44 years by the careful cultivation of consensus and the strategic presentation of power as service rather than domination. Caligula and Nero discovered that the emperor who forgot the limits of his position could find those limits enforced by assassination. A Roman emperor walked a narrow line every day of his reign. He had to appear powerful enough to be obeyed and human enough to be tolerated. He had to feed the city, entertain it, defend it from its enemies, and manage its constant, complicated, argumentative internal life. It was not a job that many people held for very long. The imperial palace on the Palatine Hill was a city within the city, a complex of buildings, gardens, and administrative machinery that housed the government of the world. The Palatine Hill, from which our word palace derives, was the heart of Roman imperial power. The emperors built progressively more elaborate structures there over the centuries, until by the time of Domitian in the late 1st century, the complex covered much of the hill and was a building of almost incomprehensible scale. Thousands of people worked and lived in the Palatine complex. Imperial freedmen, who ran the day-to-day administration of the empire, correspondence clerks who handled the volume of letters and petitions that poured in from every province, secretaries, accountants, cooks, guards, and the elaborate household staff that kept the machinery of imperial daily life running. The bureaucracy of empire was largely composed of freedmen, formerly enslaved people who had been freed by previous emperors and whose loyalty to the imperial house was, in theory, absolute. These men became some of the most powerful individuals in the Roman world, more powerful, in practical terms, than many senators because they controlled access to the emperor and managed the information that flowed to and from him. From the Palatine, on a clear day, you could see across the Forum, across the Capitoline Hill with its great temples, across the Tiber to the right bank, across the rooftops of a city that was, by the accident of history and the discipline of centuries, the center of the civilized world. It was an extraordinary view, and the men who enjoyed it knew, better than anyone, how fragile the extraordinary can be. Freed slaves, liberty occupied one of the most interesting social positions in Roman society, neither fully free nor fully equal, but capable of remarkable social mobility. When a Roman enslaved person was freed by the formal legal process of manumission, they became a libertus, a freed person. They received Roman citizenship. They took the name of their former owner as their family name, and they entered a world that was, in many respects, more open to them than it had been to freeborn people of similar modest means. Freed people could operate businesses, accumulate wealth, and in the generation of their children, complete the transition to full citizenship without any formal stain of servile origin. The children of freed people were freeborn Romans, indistinguishable in legal standing from anyone else of similar social class. This created a social mobility in Rome that was unusual in the ancient world. A man who had been enslaved could die as the owner of a prosperous business with freeborn Roman grandchildren who would have no awareness of the family's past. Trimalchio, the fictional character at the center of Petronius's Satyricon, is a comic portrait of exactly this trajectory. A former slave who has become fabulously wealthy and whose dinner parties are monuments to extravagant, slightly misjudged taste. The joke is not entirely unkind. Roman society knew that wealth could be acquired in a generation, and that the traditional markers of status were constantly being complicated by the realities of commerce, service, and the fundamental human drive to improve one's condition. Roman medicine was a mixture of genuine empirical observation, inherited Greek theory, and ritual practice that was more effective than its reputation sometimes suggests. The great medical tradition of Rome was largely inherited from Greece, specifically from the tradition of Hippocrates and his successors. The theory of the four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, governed Roman medical thinking, and treatments were oriented toward restoring the balance among these humors. But Roman medicine was not only theoretical. The military necessity of keeping soldiers functional produced significant practical expertise in wound care, surgery, and the management of infections. Military surgeons operated with a repertoire of instruments, scalpels, bone saws, forceps, catheters that were sophisticated by any pre-modern standard. Galen of Pergamon, physician to the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, and the most influential medical writer of the Roman world, combined Greek theory with extensive practical observation. His anatomical knowledge, derived largely from dissections of animals and the wounds of gladiators he treated earlier in his career, was remarkable. His theoretical framework, however, would delay medical progress for over 1,000 years because of the authority his name carried. For ordinary Romans, the first line of medical care was home treatment, herbal remedies, poultices, prayers to the gods of healing, and the practical knowledge accumulated in any household that has dealt with illness across generations. A physician was a significant expense and an uncertain intervention. The Roman approach to medicine was, ultimately, pragmatic. You tried what you could. You appealed to Asclepius. You hoped. The Roman army's engineering achievements were perhaps more significant than its military victories. Roads, bridges, aqueducts, and fortifications that reshaped the physical landscape of Europe permanently. When a Roman legion was not fighting, it was building. This was not a secondary activity. It was a core part of what the legion was and what it did. Roads came first. The Roman road network at its peak stretched over 250,000 miles, a figure that encompasses primary roads, but hints at a system of connectivity that had no equivalent in the ancient world. These roads were built to last, with foundations of gravel and rubite, surfaces of fitted stone, drainage channels on both sides, and a camber that shed rainwater. The roads moved armies. They also moved information through the cursus publicus, the imperial postal system, which could carry a message from Rome to the edges of the empire at speeds that would not be surpassed for nearly 15 centuries. Bridges, aqueducts, fortified camps that became towns, harbor improvements, drainage systems. The legions built an infrastructure whose traces are still visible across Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. And behind all of it was the Roman military's most underappreciated skill: logistics. The ability to feed, supply, pay, and move an army of tens of thousands of men across hostile territory, while simultaneously building the infrastructure to support them, was an organizational achievement that military historians have admired ever since. The Roman concept of amicitia, friendship, was a public, social, and sometimes deeply emotional relationship that structured much of Roman civic life. The Latin word amicitia translates as friendship, but covers a broader range of relationships than that English word typically implies. Amicitia included warm personal affection between social equals, but it also encompassed the network of obligations, loyalties, and mutual support that structured Roman public life at every level. A man's amici, his friends, were his allies, his advocates, his recommenders, his social safety net. The letter of recommendation, the litterae commendaticae, was a practical instrument of friendship, by which a man with influence could help a friend of lower standing gain access to an opportunity or a person that the friend could not reach alone. Cicero's letters to his friends, collected in the Epistulae ad Familiares, are among the most humanly immediate documents to survive from the ancient world. In them, you find not a great orator performing for posterity, but a complicated, anxious, vain, genuinely loving man writing to people he actually cared about. He worries about money. He mourns the death of his daughter with a grief so palpable it crosses 2,000 years without losing its force. He is irritated by people who have treated him badly and gratified by people who have been kind. The great Romans, seen through their private correspondence, are surprisingly recognizable, which is, perhaps, the most important thing that Roman history gives us: the recognition that the distance between then and now is smaller than the columns and the togas and the bronze statues suggest. Dinner, the cena, was the central ritual of Roman social life, and it came in versions ranging from the humble to the spectacularly extravagant. The Roman day was organized around its endpoint. Everything that happened before the late afternoon was, in a sense, preliminary to the cena, the main meal, which began in the late afternoon and could, for the wealthy, continue well into the night. For most Romans, the cena was simple: bread, olives, a vegetable stew, perhaps some cheese, or a few sardines, or a piece of salt pork if the week had been a good one, eaten at a low table, on a couch or a stool, in the company of family and perhaps a neighbor or two, with a cup of watered wine. For the wealthy Roman host, the cena was theater, diplomacy, and performance combined. The formal dinner party, the convivium, was one of the great Roman art forms, and it was taken very seriously. Guests reclined on couches arranged around 3 sides of a table, the triclinium arrangement, 3 couches for 9 diners at the ideal dinner. They ate with their fingers from shared dishes, with knives for cutting and spoons for liquids. Napkins were provided, and the custom of bringing your own was sufficiently common that the word for a guest's personal napkin entered the language. The meal proceeded through courses: eggs and appetizers, the gustatio. The main courses, the prima and secunda mensa, featuring roasted meats, fish, elaborate preparations of vegetables and legumes, dessert pastries, fruits, honeyed wine. But the food was secondary. What the dinner was really for was conversation. The best Roman hosts were celebrated not for their cooks, but for the quality of their table talk. Evening in Rome now. The carts are beginning to roll again through the darkening streets. The last bathers are leaving the thermae. In 1,000 dining rooms across the city, the wine is being mixed and the couches are being arranged, and the question of who is coming to dinner tonight is being answered. There is something very peaceful about imagining Rome from the outside at this hour. From above, perhaps from the Palatine or the Aventine or the Janiculum across the river, you would see the city as a field of small lights beginning to flicker in the dusk. Lamps in windows, torches at doorways, the glow of charcoal braziers visible through open shutters. A million people settling into their evening. A million different versions of this moment. The senator's elaborate dinner, the soldier's meal in the barracks, the widow alone with her lamp and her bread, the children falling asleep on their mat while their parents whispered in the next room. Rome at night. Let's go a little further into it. Roman dinner conversation was considered an art form, and the host's ability to manage it was as important as the quality of the food. At a well-run Roman dinner party, conversation was structured rather than spontaneous. The host was responsible for introducing topics, managing transitions, drawing out quieter guests, and keeping the tone appropriately balanced between serious and entertaining. Philosophy was always acceptable at the Roman table. The great philosophical questions, the nature of the good life, the proper relationship to death, the sources of happiness were perennial dinner topics, precisely because Romans took philosophy not as an academic exercise, but as a practical guide to living. How should a person face adversity? What is owed to friendship? Does wealth make a person happy? These were not rhetorical questions. They were the questions that Romans genuinely argued about at dinner, with the seriousness of people who expected the answers to affect their lives. Literature was another staple. A well-educated Roman host might have a reader, a literate enslaved person, with a good voice read a passage of Virgil or Pliny as a dinner entertainment. Poetry was recited. The latest published work was discussed, and gossip, always gossip. Who had done what to whom in the forum that morning? Which senator had made a fool of himself before the emperor? Which actress had taken a new lover? Which merchant had gone bankrupt? Rome was a village that happened to contain 1 million people, and the dinner table was where the village conducted its essential business of knowing itself. The Roman relationship to wine was central to social life and governed by strict conventions that made it as much about ritual as pleasure. Romans drank wine constantly, but they did not drink it the way we drink wine today. Undiluted wine marum was considered uncivilized, the drink of barbarians. A proper Roman mixed his wine with water in a large vessel called a crater, typically in a ratio of 1 part wine to 2 or 3 parts water. The mixing was done by a designated slave, the magister bibendi, who also controlled the pace of drinking at a formal dinner. In some dinner party traditions, the guests chose one person to serve as the drinking master for the evening, and his decisions about the ratio and the pace were binding. This was partly practical. It kept the evening from devolving into chaos, and partly social performance. The wines of the Roman world varied enormously in quality and price. The finest Italian wines, the Falernian of Campania, the Cacuban, were aged for years or decades and commanded prices that put them far beyond ordinary reach. Ordinary table wine was much rougher, sometimes treated with resin or seawater or honey to modify its taste, and consumed in enormous quantities throughout the empire. Wine at a formal dinner was accompanied by libations to the gods at the beginning of the meal and at various moments throughout. These small, ritual pourings kept the divine relationship in its proper order even in the most secular social context. Roman nightlife, for those who could afford to participate in it, was vibrant, varied, and occasionally dangerous. After dark, the streets of Rome took on a different character. The carts and their noise, the morning commerce, the bright and busy public life of the day, all of this retreated, and a different Rome emerged. For the wealthy, the evening continued in private, the dinner party extended by music, by theatrical performances, by troops of entertainers, by dice games and conversation that stretched into the small hours. Musicians, the most skilled of them famous throughout the city, performed at private parties. Troops of mime artists put on comic performances. Dancers of extraordinary technical skill commanded audiences in the dining rooms of the elite. Taverns, the tabernae, were busy until late. Wine shops served their regular clientele of working men and women who could not afford private entertainment but wanted the company of their neighbors and a cup of something to close the day. Games of dice, strictly speaking illegal, but universally practiced, were played at tavern tables across the city. The Poppenai, rougher establishments than the respectable tabernae, offered a combination of food, drink, and the various other services that cities have always provided in their less respectable establishments. These places had a consistent reputation in Roman literature for providing exactly what their customers wanted and nothing that anyone respectable would admit to wanting. Music was everywhere in Roman life, at religious ceremonies, in the theater, at dinner parties, on the march, at funerals, but we cannot hear a single note of it. This is one of the most poignant losses in all of classical civilization. We know a great deal about Roman music, the instruments, the occasions, the cultural importance, the technical vocabulary. What we do not have is any reliable way to reconstruct what it sounded like. The instruments were various. The tibia, a double-piped wind instrument, whose sound probably resembled an oboe. The cithara, a large, plucked string instrument associated with Apollo and with the highest musical prestige. The tuba, a long, straight bronze horn used in military contexts. The cornu, a curved horn. The cymbals, tambourines, and clappers that appeared in religious processions and theatrical contexts. Music in Rome was inescapable. It accompanied sacrifices at the altar. It marked military movements. It provided rhythm to theatrical performances. It played at private dinner parties in the evenings. Funeral processions moved to music. And yet all of it is gone. We can reconstruct the words of Roman poetry, much of which was designed to be sung, rather than simply read. But we cannot hear the tune. The silence where Roman music should be is one of history's quietly devastating absences. The theater was one of the great public entertainments of Rome, and Roman audiences were famously difficult to impress. Roman theater was descended from Greek tragedy and comedy, but had evolved into its own distinctive forms over the centuries of the Republic and Empire. The most popular theatrical forms were not the elevated tragedies that sophisticated Romans claimed to prefer. They were the mimes and the pantomimes, physical performance art that required extraordinary skill and offered storylines that leaned heavily toward the comic, the dramatic, and the occasionally scandalous. The pantomimist solo dancer who performed narratives through movement and gesture, accompanied by a chorus and orchestra, was one of Rome's great entertainment stars. The best pantomime performers were celebrities of a celebrity culture that would be immediately recognizable today. They had fans who argued about their relative merits in the streets. They had feuds with each other that were followed with interest across the city. Some became wealthy and socially prominent beyond anything their art should theoretically have permitted. Roman theater buildings were large and impressive. The Theater of Marcellus, which still stands in Rome today in recognizable form, seated perhaps 14,000 people. Theater attendance was free, or nearly so, during the great public festivals when theatrical performances were offered as part of the celebrations. The crowd was loud, responsive, and unforgiving of poor performance. Romans did not suffer boredom quietly. The chariot races at the Circus Maximus drew larger crowds than any other Roman entertainment and inspired a fanaticism that would embarrass modern sports fans. The Circus Maximus, the great racetrack that filled the valley between the Palatine and Aventine hills, was the largest entertainment venue in the ancient world. At its peak, it could accommodate perhaps 200,000 spectators, a number that makes any modern sports stadium seem intimate by comparison. The races themselves were short 7 laps of the 2,000-foot track, completed in less than 15 minutes, but the program of a race day offered up to 24 individual races, making a full day at the Circus Maximus an event of extraordinary sustained excitement. The 4 racing teams, the blues, the greens, the reds, and the whites, inspired a passionate team loyalty that transcended class, gender, and social position. Senators supported the blues. Slaves supported the greens. Emperors, notably Caligula and Nero, were obsessively devoted to particular factions. Pliny the Younger wrote with bemused exasperation about spectators who drove miles to attend races when they could have stayed home, if what they actually cared about was the horses and the driving since the colors were what they were truly there to see. Charioteers were superstars. The most successful accumulated prize money that made them genuinely wealthy by Roman standards. Their names were written on walls. Their images appeared on lamps and glassware. Children playing in the streets of Rome had their favorite charioteer the way children anywhere have their favorite athlete. The Roman concept of odium leisure was not idleness, but the higher use of time freed from obligation. Negotium business, public obligation, the active life of the forum and the law courts was considered the necessary foundation of a Roman man's life. But odium, the time freed from negotium, was considered the space in which the truly important activities of life could take place. Reading, writing, philosophical reflection, conversation with friends, the cultivation of the mind, and the appreciation of beauty. These were the activities that elevated the Roman gentleman above mere functionality and made him fully human in the Roman understanding of what that meant. The great Romans who wrote about this distinction, Cicero, Pliny the Younger, Horace, were unanimous that odium properly used was the highest form of Roman life. Horace's odes celebrate this ideal most beautifully: the country estate, the simple table, the good wine, the trusted friend, the afternoon without obligation. What is striking about this ideal is how recognizable it remains. The dream of a life with enough space for reflection, beauty, connection, and rest, a life not entirely consumed by the demands of making a living, is not a Roman invention. But the Romans articulated it with particular clarity and particular longing, because they lived in a world that made the ideal very difficult to achieve. Literacy in Rome was more widespread than in most ancient civilizations, but its distribution across the population was deeply unequal. The walls of Pompeii are covered in writing, electoral slogans, personal insults, love declarations, quotes from literature, business advertisements, records of bets and debts. This abundance of casual writing implies a population with at least functional literacy widespread enough to make written communication on public walls worthwhile. But what kind of literacy, and how widely distributed? Historians debate this. Functional literacy, the ability to read simple signs, instructions, and notices, was probably fairly common among urban Romans. Full literary literacy, the ability to read and appreciate Virgil, to write a sophisticated letter, to engage with philosophical texts, was concentrated in the educated classes. Reading was generally done aloud in the ancient world, not silently as we typically do it today. The experience of reading was partially auditory. Books, volumen, scrolls were unwieldy objects that required two hands to manage and a certain physical practice to navigate efficiently. Public reading was common. Authors read new works to invited audiences at recitations, the recitatio, that were both literary events and social obligations. Wealthier Romans had educated slaves read aloud to them while they ate, bathed, or traveled in their litters. Writing, in the sense of actually forming letters rather than dictating, was often delegated to specialized scribes. Many important Romans composed by dictation, with a secretary who could write fast enough to keep up. Rome's relationship with its provinces was complex, sometimes exploitative, sometimes generative, always built on a power differential that Rome rarely acknowledged. The empire was not simply Rome writ large. It was a collection of vastly different cultures, languages, economies, and histories, held together by Roman military power, Roman administrative systems, and the particular Roman genius for co-opting local elites into the machinery of imperial governance. In some provinces, Roman rule brought genuine material improvements: roads, aqueducts, security from external threats, access to Mediterranean trade networks. In others, it meant extraction of resources, heavy taxation, conscription into the army, and the systematic subordination of local culture and authority to Roman preferences. The most successful Roman provinces were those where local aristocracies found it profitable and honorable to become Roman, to take Latin names, build Roman-style buildings, speak Latin in the forum, send their children to Rome for education. By the time of the Emperor Hadrian, The empire was governed by provincial Romans, who were more Roman than many inhabitants of the city of Rome itself. But the provinces were never simply junior Romes. They maintained their languages, their religious practices, their social structures, and their memories beneath the Roman administrative surface. And when Roman power weakened in the western provinces from the 3rd century onward, the local identities that had never been fully submerged resurfaced with extraordinary speed. The Roman concept of gravitas, weight, seriousness, moral authority was one of the virtues most admired in public life, and most consistently failed by the men who claimed it. The ideal Roman was a person of gravitas, a word that implies not just seriousness of manner but a depth of character, a moral steadiness, a quality of weight and consequence that commanded respect without demanding it. Alongside gravitas, the Roman virtue list included pietas, proper devotion to the gods, parents, and state; virtus, courage, excellence, the willingness to do what was hard; fides, faithfulness to one's word and one's obligations; clementia, mercy and restraint in the exercise of power; dignitas, the personal honor that gave a man standing in public life. These were not empty words. They structured Roman public discourse, shaped political identity, and provided the vocabulary within which Roman men judged each other and were judged. A man who lacked gravitas was dismissed. A man who violated fides was disgraced. A man who displayed clementia at the right moment earned a reputation that lasted. And yet Roman history is, in part, a catalogue of spectacular failures of every one of these virtues by men who claimed them loudly. The most pompous declarations of gravitas came from the most self-interested of men. The most enthusiastic promoters of pietas were often the most personally corrupt. This gap between ideal and reality is not a Roman peculiarity. It is simply human. And the Romans were honest enough, at least in their literature, to document the gap with a wit and clarity that makes it recognizable across every century since. The night is deep now over Rome. The lamps are burning lower in the apartments and the dinner parties. The streets are rumbling again with the carts that Rome needs to keep itself alive through the dark hours. Somewhere on the Palatine, an emperor is reading dispatches from the eastern frontier by lamplight. In the Subura, the crowded, chaotic neighborhood below the Esquiline Hill, a family is sleeping on their mat, all 4 of them in the one room that is their entire world, their breath moving in the cool darkness. At the edge of the city, where the torchlit roads lead out past the tombs of the ancestors, a traveler is arriving, tired and dusty, his mind still full of whatever distant place he has come from. He will find Rome tomorrow. Tonight, he just needs to find his door. We are almost through the Roman day. Let's stay a little longer in the dark before we let it go. Rome's relationship with death was more intimate and more public than anything most modern societies maintain. Death in Rome was not hidden. The dead lined the roads out of the city in their tombs, their epitaphs readable to every traveler who passed. The bones of the ancestors were present in the home in the lararium, the household shrine, where the wax imagines of distinguished forebears were kept and honored. Roman epitaphs are among the most direct records of human feeling to survive from the ancient world. Short, carved in stone, designed to address the passing traveler directly. Siste, viator, stop, traveler. Then the life briefly summarized. The years given, the name of the person left behind, husband, wife, parent, child who paid for the stone, and whose grief is there in the formula, as present and as permanent as the carved letters themselves. Some epitaphs are formal and conventional. Others are heartbreakingly personal, parents mourning children who did not survive infancy, husbands recording the virtues of wives who preceded them with a specificity that moves beyond formula into something genuinely felt. She kept the house. She made the wool. She was kind to strangers. She never quarreled. These are the things that a Roman considered worth recording, not great deeds or public honors. The small, daily evidence of a good life lived alongside other people. Romans believed deeply in the power of names, and the Roman naming system reveals the social structure of the entire civilization in miniature. A Roman citizen had 3 names: the tria nomina, that encoded his identity, his family, and his social position simultaneously. The praenomen was the personal name Gaius, Marcus, Lucius, a small set of options that Romans recycled so consistently that a family with 3 sons named Marcus, Marcus, and Marcus was not unusual and differentiated them by number rather than creativity. The nomen was the family name Julius, Claudius, Cornelius, Tullius, which identified the gens, the extended kinship group to which a person belonged. This was the most socially significant name, the one that carried the weight of ancestry and social identity. The cognomen was an additional name, originally a personal nickname, that became heritable within branches of great families. Cicero, which means chickpea, was a cognomen. Caesar, possibly meaning the thick head of hair, was another. Enslaved people typically had only a single name. Freed people took the praenomen and nomen of their former owner as their new name, adding their old name as a cognomen, making every freed person's name a small record of their social history. Women's names in Rome were typically simply the feminine form of the family name: Claudia, Cornelia, Julia, sometimes distinguished by birth order, Claudia Prima, Claudia Secunda. The individuality we assign to names today was not a Roman priority. The Pantheon, still standing in Rome today, still with its original roof, was the most extraordinary engineering achievement of the Roman world. The Pantheon as we know it was built under the Emperor Hadrian around 125 CE, replacing an earlier structure on the same site. Its defining feature, the great concrete dome, 43 meters in diameter, with a circular oculus at its apex, remains one of the most extraordinary architectural achievements in human history. The dome was built in Roman concrete, which was made with volcanic ash and which has proven, over 20 centuries, to be more durable than most modern concrete mixes. Its construction required technical knowledge of structural loads, materials behavior, and precision of execution that we are still working to fully understand. The oculus, the open eye at the dome's apex, is unglazed. Rain falls through it onto the slightly convex floor, which is drain-fitted to carry the water away. Light moves through it across the day, a shaft of illumination that tracks around the interior walls, like the pointer of a sundial that operates at architectural scale. To stand inside the Pantheon today, and you can, it is still a functioning building, still as Hadrian left it is to feel something difficult to name. Not just awe at the scale, something more specific than that. The recognition that an intention formed 2,000 years ago, carried out in stone and volcanic ash by hands that have been dust for 2 millennia, is still here, still doing exactly what it was designed to do. Some things endure. The Roman army's presence on the frontiers created new towns, new languages, new cultures, and changed the people it was meant simply to guard. Along the Rhine and the Danube, along Hadrian's Wall in Britain, along the desert frontiers of Syria and Arabia, the Roman military presence was not simply a line of soldiers. It was a moving edge of civilization in the Roman sense, and a point of constant, complex interaction with the peoples beyond it. Roman frontier towns grew up around military camps. Merchants followed the army. Local people came to trade, to work, to marry soldiers who were permitted to form unofficial families even when the rules technically prohibited formal marriages during service. Languages mixed, religions combined. Children grew up speaking Latin and their father's Celtic or Germanic tongue simultaneously. When soldiers completed their service, they often stayed in the regions where they had served, rather than returning to a homeland they had left as young men. They became the first permanent Roman settlers in places that had never been part of Rome in any administrative sense, and the peoples on the other side of the frontier were changed by the contact as surely as the soldiers were. Germanic leaders adopted Roman military techniques, Roman political models, and Roman luxury goods while maintaining the social structures and values of their own traditions. The barbarian who crossed into Rome and eventually, in the 5th century, overwhelmed it, was not simply a stranger. He was, in many ways, a Roman of a different kind. The eruption of Vesuvius in 79 CE was a catastrophe that preserved a moment of Roman daily life with an accuracy that no deliberate historical record could have achieved. On the morning of August 24th, 79 CE, people in the town of Pompeii were going about their ordinary lives. The thermopolium owners were setting out their food. The bakers were pulling bread from the ovens. A man was eating a quick meal at a counter. A dog was sleeping in the sun in someone's doorway. By evening, 12 to 20 feet of volcanic ash, pumice, and pyroclastic material had buried the town, and everything and everyone in it. The eruption was catastrophic. Perhaps 2,000 people died in Pompeii alone. The human cost of the disaster is written in the casts made from the voids left by bodies preserved in the ash. A woman shielding a child, a group huddled in a room, a man fallen mid-step on a street. But what the eruption also did, inadvertently and permanently, was stop time. Pompeii in August of 79 CE was a prosperous small Roman city, doing what prosperous small Roman cities did. And when the ash settled and hardened around it, it stayed exactly that way until archaeologists began to uncover it in the 18th century. The election posters still readable on the walls, the menus still interpretable on the thermopolium counters, the furniture still in place in the houses, the graffiti still legible on every available surface. Quisquis amat veniat. Let whoever loves come here. Scratched on a wall in Pompeii, 2,000 years later, still perfectly legible. The fall of the Western Roman Empire was not a single event. It was a long, complicated process that Romans living through it often didn't recognize as the end of anything. In 476 CE, the last emperor of the Western Roman Empire, a teenager named Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by a Germanic leader named Odoacer, who then governed Italy without bothering to name a new emperor. Later, historians marked this moment as the fall of Rome, but the people living in Rome in 476 CE did not experience it as the end of their civilization. Life continued. Churches continued to function in the shell of old pagan temples. The aqueducts, some of them still ran. The Latin language was still spoken, would continue to be spoken, would eventually evolve into Italian and French and Spanish. The fall of Rome was less like a building collapsing and more like a river changing its course. The water was still there. It was simply going somewhere different. What actually changed, in the western provinces, was the loss of the administrative and military infrastructure that had held the vast, diverse system together. Without reliable taxation, without maintained roads and frontiers, without the legal and bureaucratic machinery that the empire had provided, the provinces fragmented into smaller, more local units of power. The bishops of the church, whose organization followed the geographic outlines of the Roman administrative system, became the most stable form of institutional authority in many regions. The Roman idea survived in the church, long after the Roman state had dissolved into memory and ruins. The legacy of Roman language is so pervasive that we use it constantly without awareness. Roman words for Roman things that have never stopped being useful. Latin never died. It evolved. Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian. These are Latin languages not descended from Latin, the way that children are descended from parents, but continuous with it. The same river still running. The technical vocabulary of law, medicine, philosophy, and science in the English-speaking world is overwhelmingly Latin in origin. When a lawyer writes habeas corpus or in loco parentis, when a doctor diagnoses a femur fracture, when a philosopher discusses de facto authority, these are Roman words, used because the Romans built the frameworks and named them first. Even words that seem entirely English turn out, on examination, to have passed through Latin before they reached us. Calendar, campus, library, candidate candidatus, the white-robed man who sought election, chalk dusted to show his purity and visibility. Salary, salarium, the salt payment or salt allowance that Roman soldiers received. The words are still doing what they were designed to do, naming things, enabling communication, carrying meaning across enormous distances of time and transformation. The Roman achievement in architecture was not only technical, it was philosophical, expressing ideas about power, community, and human possibility in stone and concrete. The Romans did not invent the arch. They did not invent concrete. They did not invent the vault or the dome. What they did was take these elements and use them with a confidence, a consistency, and a scale that transformed them from techniques into a language. The language of Roman architecture said, "We are here, and we are here to stay." The great public buildings, the forums, the basilicas, the baths, the theaters, the amphitheaters were designed to communicate the permanence of Roman civilization and the generosity of Roman power to anyone who entered them. Aqueducts said, "We will provide." Roads said, "We will connect." The defensive walls of cities said, "We will protect." And the temples, with their columns and their pediments and their gilded roofs, said, "We honor powers greater than ourselves, and we do it in a manner worthy of those powers." When later civilizations, medieval European, Renaissance Italian, the neoclassical architects of the 18th and 19th centuries returned to Roman architectural forms, they were not being conservative. They were reaching for the same ideas that those forms embodied: permanence, community, the material expression of civic aspiration. There are reasons the United States Capitol looks the way it does, reasons the British Museum looks the way it does. The Romans built so durably and so meaningfully that everything built in their shadow still carries their intention. The story of Rome is also the story of every person who lived in it without leaving a name. The millions who built, cooked, cleaned, carried, suffered, and hoped without making it into the history books. For every Cicero, there were 10,000 people who cleaned his house and carried his letters and cooked his food and mended his sandals and will never be individually known to history. For every emperor, there were 1,000,000 ordinary Romans whose daily lives, cumulatively, were the actual substance of what Rome was. We know some of them through the accident of survival: the freedwoman whose gravestone was preserved, the soldier whose writing tablet was protected by a Northumberland bog for 2,000 years, the child whose wax tablet schoolwork was found in the rubble of a Pompeii street. Vindolanda, on Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain, has yielded hundreds of writing tablets, the thin wooden leaves on which soldiers and their families wrote their letters and their lists. One is a birthday party invitation from one officer's wife to another. One is a request for more beer. One is a complaint about the quality of the local roads. One ends with the phrase that translates, with an immediacy that stops the breath, "Farewell, my sister, and may you live well." A woman on the edge of the Roman Empire, writing to her friend 2,000 years ago. The tenderness is completely intact. The distance is nothing. Rome is over, but it is also, in ways both obvious and subtle, still entirely here, in our laws, our languages, our cities, our ideas about government, justice, and what a civilization should aspire to be. The Roman Empire ended, but the Roman experiment, the attempt to create a civilization large enough to include millions of people of different cultures and languages and beliefs, held together by law, by trade, by a shared infrastructure, by common institutions, did not end with it. Every modern state that organizes itself around written law is, in some meaningful sense, a Roman inheritance. Every city with a public square, a shared water supply, a network of roads connecting it to other cities, is playing out a Roman logic. Every legal system that distinguishes between public and private law, that protects property and contract, that extends rights across boundaries of birth and origin, has Roman foundations. This is not to say that Rome was good. It was not only good. It was a civilization built on slavery, on conquest, on the systematic exploitation of weak by strong, on violence deployed with extraordinary efficiency. These things are part of its legacy too, and they cannot be separated from the aqueducts and the poetry. But what Rome at its best imagined a world connected by shared institutions, governed by law rather than pure force, capable of including different peoples in a common project. This imagining has not lost its power. We are still working out what it means. We are still trying to build it. In that sense, Rome is not a past civilization. It is an ongoing argument about what civilization should be, and the argument continues in streets that Rome itself once paved. And so we come to the end of our long day in Rome. We walked out before dawn into streets still noisy with the last delivery carts of the night. We stood in the Forum as the law courts opened, and the morning filled with argument and commerce in the theater of power. We sat at a thermopolium counter and ate something simple and good while the city moved around us. We descended into the warmth of the baths and felt the particular Roman pleasure of being clean and social and at ease in the middle of the afternoon. We ate dinner on a couch in someone's triclinium, and we talked too long, and the wine was well mixed, and the lamp burned lower as the evening turned. We watched gladiators who were athletes and celebrities and men with everything to prove. We heard the roar of 200,000 people in the Circus Maximus, and the quiet of a single lamp burning in a sixth-floor apartment where someone was falling asleep to the sound of the city. We met the emperor in his palace, and the slave in her work, and the freedman in his shop, and the soldier on his wall, and the woman whose epitaph is still readable on a stone that has been standing since before your great-grandmother's great-grandmother was born. We walked through a city that was, in many ways, the first version of the world we still live in, complicated and contradictory, and magnificent and brutal and brilliantly alive. If this long, quiet journey through Rome brought you something calm, curiosity, a sense of the strange depth of the world, I would be honored if you would like and subscribe, or leave a word in the comments below. It helps this channel find the ears of others who are looking for a softer place to rest at the end of the day, one sleepy traveler at a time. But for now, you don't need to hold on to any of it. Let the Forum fade. Let the torches go out, one by one, along the streets below the Palatine. Let the last cartwheel echo away into silence, and let the city finally grow quiet. Let your jaw unclench. Let your shoulders drop. Feel the weight of your body settle into whatever is beneath you, the way a city settles at the end of a long day, slowly releasing the tension of all that noise and motion and life into a stillness that is not emptiness. It is not emptiness, it is rest. Somewhere, right now, the stars are turning over 7 hills above a brown river. The same stars that turned over the Pantheon when Hadrian dedicated it. The same stars that lit the road for travelers who arrived at Rome's gates before dawn, with their minds full of wherever they had come from. The same stars that are turning, quietly, above wherever you are tonight. Let your breathing find its own slow river. Let the images of Rome drift through you and past you the marble, the lamplight, the smell of bread and pine resin and stone warm from the afternoon sun. You do not need to go anywhere. You do not need to do anything. The city has been there for 2,000 years. It will be there when you wake. Sleep well, and good night.